Hello, our truth warriors. Well, it's a special occasion. It's the 40th episode of our podcast today, so we are making progress. Now, today's guest and topic has been one we've been wanting to discuss for a long time, as it is the biggest elephant in the room in regards to the lies we have been told. Now, with a career of 35 years and flying over 20,000 hours in 15 types of aircraft, the man behind 9/11 pilots, I welcome to the Atlantic Underground podcast, Captain Dan Hanley.
Well, thank you, Chris and Johnny, for having me on their program. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, and we really appreciate you giving us your time as well. We know you're very busy, so thank you very much. I'd like to start out, Dan, if you could maybe give us a little background for our audience, a little bit about yourself and about your career in aviation, if you could.
Okay. Well, I flew airplanes my entire career. I started out at age 19 over 50 years ago in 1968, first as a civilian pilot with the desire to become a commercial airline pilot eventually. And over the course of 2 years, I got my private commercial instrument and multi-engine rating. And before I went on to a four-year university, I went to a community college to get those ratings. And I went on to Southern Illinois University and got an applied math degree. And when I graduated in 1973, the Vietnam War was still raging, and it was either get drafted into the Army and go over to Vietnam or choose another military career path. And I chose naval aviation. So in 1973, I entered flight training, and over the course of a year, I flew three different prop aircraft and got my wings in April of 74. I went on to fly the P-3 Orion aircraft. You're probably not familiar with it. It's a four-engine turboprop used to track Russian Soviet submarines during the Cold War. So I flew those aircraft until 1978 when United Airlines hired me. And over the course of the next 25 years, I flew 7 different aircraft, accruing totally, as you mentioned, 20,000 flight hours and 15 different aircraft over a career span of 35 years. So that, and I would like to say at the beginning, because we're going to be discussing 9/11, that with my experience, I can state without reservation or embarrassment that I could not have flown the 9/11 flight profiles, and neither could the supposed 9/11 hijackers. So
Yeah.
that we can talk about that in just a bit here, I guess.
Yeah. Now, with all the work you've done on this, backed by so many other pilots who have come forward and said exactly what you've just said now, why do you think your cause has not been all over the news? What is it that's stopping this message getting out to people?
Well, you got to go look at the complicity that the mainstream, corporate-owned and controlled mainstream media has in covering up 9/11 for over 20 years. Believe me, I've tried to get on mainstream news, but nobody will have you. Architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, scientists for 9/11 Truth, the Lawyers Committee, we're all going to podcasts and alternative media just to get our word out. That's why I appreciate you guys having me on the program here today. But that's the biggest culprit, and I can talk about how we're being stonewalled by the government right now a little bit later.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So could you tell us, Dan, about the circumstances that led to your termination as a civilian pilot with United Airlines?
Okay, I'll make it very brief because I've spent a whole program discussing this. But essentially, in 2002, I started seeing massive holes in the aviation security system, and I was flying out of New York at the time with crews who had lost friends in United 93 in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And they were very afraid in the back of the airplane because we had been made all kind of promises like cameras in the back of the aircraft, secondary barrier protections, federal air marshals, and reinforced cockpit door. None of this stuff was happening. So they were asking me to speak out, which I did. And initially I just went to my union leaders in New York that I knew personally and my chief pilot as well, and told them, hey, look, I've got a lot of scared flight attendants and pilots here, and we're not getting anything done. And so I started writing letters and sending in federally mandated reports. And my first clue that I was getting blowback was when I was told, watch it, Dan, these guys are nasty. If you take it to the next level, you're going to get hurt.
Yeah.
The company thinks you're a big mouth, loose cannon whistleblower and wants you to go away. So I didn't heed their warning and decided to protect myself by establishing a correspondence trail and even recording conversations with friends of mine just to protect myself. And I had seen it happen in the past where United and the FAA the Federal Aviation Administration got together and concocted schemes to rid dissident pilots from the ranks. So I was protecting myself in that regard. And it got to a point where I was I was getting nowhere, and I was going to write the chief executive officer of United Airlines a letter saying, hey, my reports and correspondence is getting stonewalled, and I feel that the pressure being exerted by the bankruptcy on the union is precluding them from representing me legally in this matter. And I called my union leader in New York and said, Mark, I'm going to send this letter to Glenn Tilton. And he said, please send it to me first, and I'll forward it to the lawyers in Chicago to review it. So I said, I'm not going to sit on it. This has been going on for some time. So I waited for about a week, didn't hear anything. And I called him and I said, okay, I'm going to London. When I get back, if I don't have an answer, I'm sending the letter. So I was over the JFK food court sitting amongst a bunch of people when I get a call on my cell phone from the head lawyer for the union and the grievance committee chairman. They have me on speakerphone. And I said, Bob, did you read my letter? And he says, yes. I said, does it any way violate federal aviation regulations, the company policy, or the Airline Pilots Association Code of Ethics? He goes, no. I said, do you agree with the content of the letter? He goes, yes. I said, well, you're my union lawyer. What do you represent what do you recommend that I do here? He goes, don't send in the letter. I said, well, wait a minute. I thought you just told me you agreed with it. And he says, I did. And the grievance committee chairman said, Dan, go ahead and send that letter in if you never want to fly another United Airlines airplane again in your life. I said, why? What will they do to me? He says, they'll find a way of professionally, medically, psychologically, or otherwise ground you for life as a pilot. We've seen it happen in the past, as well, so have I. But I believe I protected myself. And let me back up about 6 months. I had friends and people that I knew that they had gotten on the psychological screening. It's called a fitness for duty examination. So I went to I was living in Atlanta at the time. I went to the best psychologists and psychiatrists I could find. I just said, here's where I am with United. Here's what they're going to try to do to me. I want you to screen me psychologically to prove that I'm sound mentally, which they did. I went for counseling. They ran tests on me and everything else. So I had this whole medical file on me. And I'm saying this because sometimes I go on a program and talk about this, and I get comments in the comment section saying, I'm glad this nut isn't flying an airplane anymore. But I can assure you I was mentally sound when I was doing this. So I said, well, okay, well, I'll sit on the letter and think about what I'm going to do. So I went home and waited a couple days and decided I was going to file something called a Flight Safety Awareness Report, which brought the Federal Aviation Administration into the picture, because all the other stuff was done internally in the company. So I submitted 6 of these electronically, and almost immediately I was pulled out of schedule. And my assistant chief pilot called me and said to me, look, you're going to have to come up to New York. Oh, the union had told me, I asked them, how far are you going to follow me in on this legally? And they said, not very far. Okay, so he says, you've got to come up to New York and we've got to go over these reports with you before you can fly again. And I said, well, why are you sitting on them? I submitted them in confidentiality and you violated the terms of the Flight Safety Awareness Program. I says, and if I come up there because I'm way out on the limb here legally and I don't have a union to protect me, I want my own lawyers to accompany me for our meeting. And they said, no, we can't allow that. I said, well, then I'm not protected here. and we're kind of at an impasse. Well, I was still on pay at the time, and about a week passed, and my chief pilot calls me and says to me, Dan, I was out at the Denver Training Center and ran into the chief flight surgeon for United. And he says, is Hanley one of yours? And I said, yes. And he said, put that expletive deleted on sick list. And I said, why, Bob? I haven't even seen an aeromedical professional. He goes, I'm sorry, my hands are tied on this. He told me it came from up above. So here I am out on sick list. I'm calling union lawyers. I'm calling company lawyers, trying to arrive at a compromise, even trying to set up meetings where I can have an attorney, and they weren't allowing it. Well, you only have so much sick list on the books, and I was running out of sick list and was going to go non-pay. So I called my chief pilot and said to him, what are my options now, Bob? This is going to be punitive. I haven't done anything wrong but filed some federal reports, which are mandated by federal aviation regulations. He said, well, if you submit to the Employee Assistance Program, the FAA endorses, so does the company and the union. It'll guarantee your pay coming in, and it should be able to get you back on the line. So foolishly, I says, okay. So they paid a first class ticket for me up to Chicago. I went over to see a flight surgeon. I'll wrap this up real quick. But the first words out of his mouth were, have you seen any mental health professionals? I go, yeah, as a matter of fact, I have. And for 6 months, you want to talk to him. And I flipped him, opened my cell phone and said, Doc Mo, here's Doc McGovern, talk to him, you know. Well, my intent at that point in time was to go along with the program and then file an FAA whistleblower report and expose this whole fraudulent process that they were running me through here. And he gets off the phone and he says to me, would you be willing to see one of our mental health professionals? And I said, sure, I was expecting you to ask that question. I will. So me thinking I'm protected, went over to a psychiatrist who diagnosed me as being bipolar, put me subscribed medication, which I didn't know at the time would ground me for life. And the skids were already greased. I wound up going out to Denver, seeing the ALPA, the union aeromedical consultant. And he said, we've already talked to the FAA. We're going to put you on long-term disability, leading to a permanent medical grounding. Well, as a result, I fought this thing with the government for 5 years. Here I had all this evidence, all these witnesses that were going to back me up. And I took it all the way up to the Department of Transportation Inspector General's level. They had not reviewed the tiniest shred of evidence or interviewed any of my witnesses, and they closed my case, saying that it was a done deal. So as a result of that whole process, it cost me a 27-year marriage, good marriage, the alienation of my 2 kids who blame me for the divorce, still believe the official 9/11 story, think their dad's a whacked out conspiracy nut, and they don't talk to me. And it destroyed my 35-year career and reputation as a pilot. And I lost about $4 million in pay, pension, and stock, all as a result of me just following regulations and trying to look out for aircrew and passenger safety. So it was a disaster for me. Yeah. As a matter of fact, on our website, we're going to talk about here in a minute, I've got it an About Dan Hanley page, and at the bottom of it, you can look at a long affidavit that goes into great detail on what I just described. Yeah. So
now, a lot of people watching this may not know, but the day before 9/11 happened on September the 10th, $2.3 trillion of money went missing and was discovered missing by members of the Pentagon. Now, the alert was raised the day before the attacks. Now, those working on that very same audit happened to be in the office at the Pentagon that was hit. Now, would you say that was a coincidence or just convenience?
Not hardly. When you look at the flight profile we'll discuss here with Hani Hanjour, and you look at the fact that he was able to accomplish the maneuver on the first attempt and hit the Office of Naval Intelligence, which housed the budget analyst's office, I don't think it was coincidental at all.
Yeah.
They lost over 30 auditors and all records were destroyed. There were like over 50 auditors working in there. So
Yeah.
no, I don't believe it was a coincidence at all.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I think it was pretty obvious that was the case. Yeah.
Right.
Now, Dan, I want to ask you about the BUAP uninterruptible autopilot system. So what do you know about it, and why do you feel it's so important in this 9/11 story?
Okay, well, could I get into a little bit about our website and
Yes.
organization, and
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll lead into it from there because I
Yeah, for
definitely
sure.
would like to talk about it. Okay, I currently serve as the director and international public spokesperson for a global grassroots effort called 9/11 Pilot Whistleblowers, and we got a website at 911pilots.org and a YouTube channel at 911 Pilots. If you want to go there as we're talking here to the website, I'll be covering a lot of the material on that. But the purpose of the organization is to show that there were no Muslim hijackers at the controls of the 9/11 aircraft, but that the aircraft were electronically hijacked through employment of a system called the uninterruptible autopilot, or BUAP, as you referred to it, that enables a remote source to take complete control of an aircraft autopilot and flight management computers and fly the aircraft to its target. Now, once it's engaged, the pilots can no longer disconnect the system. And our goal of the organization is to recruit highly trained and experienced military and civilian pilots, whether they're active or retired, from around the world, which we've been doing with success, and interviewing them on Skype and recording it, where they attest that not only could these hijackers not have flown the flight profiles that day, but that they could not have flown them themselves. So what are we doing this for? Well, I got to bring in the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry to show you where we're going here, and also the FAA. The Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry has a website. It's excellent. It's got a wealth of information on it. But what it is a group of U.S. lawyers got together with the biggest 9/11 whistleblowers in the world, and they compiled 57 evidence packages and presented it to the U.S. Attorney in New York City, forcing him to convene a grand jury investigation into their allegations that World Trade Center buildings 1, 2, and 7 were brought down by controlled demolition and not by jet aircraft impact damages or the fuel fires that ensued. So the Department of Justice is still trying to, and the National Institute of Standards and Technology are trying to stonewall the grand jury investigation. There's a lot of legal action being taken by the Lawyers Committee, but we can get back to them in a while and talk about who's involved there and who they're working with that presented this evidence to them. But they don't leave. I've talked with the board of directors for the Lawyers Committee, and they know exactly what we're doing. And they always want me to emphasize when I go on programs that they're not legally representing us at present, that they're remaining neutral, but they are well aware of what we are doing. And if in the future we can produce enough evidence and testimony, they'll move forward with this. So they keep telling me we're in the dugout waiting our turn at bat. It's not our turn up yet, because they've got other issues they're addressing too, like the anthrax letters that were sent out after 9/11. So on the other side, in August last year, I filed via the FAA hotline a whistleblower report alleging what I just stated, and dumped a wealth of information on it to back my allegations that these aircraft were remotely controlled. And about a week later, I got a receipt from them acknowledging that they'd received it, and they gave me a case number for it. And then about another week later, I get an email from a FAA aeronautical engineer in Seattle who said he'd be my point of contact with the FAA, and he wanted to arrange a three-way Skype call the next day to discuss what we were going to be investigating. And I acknowledged that. And then the next morning, when I acknowledged the email, I sent him even more information on the uninterruptible autopilot. Okay, I sent him a 62-page document on it. And he came back to me the next morning and said, we didn't realize the depth and breadth of the information you're presenting. We're going to need a little bit more time to look it over. So I had his phone number and I called him, and we talked to him for about 10 minutes. And I asked him a few questions, and it turned out he was a private pilot. And I said, well, I'm not going to ask you if you could have flown a Boeing 767 with your private pilot's license. But we had about a 10-minute discussion. And after, that was the last communication I had with him. He shut me down electronically. No, it wouldn't respond to emails. He wouldn't respond to phone call messages I left him. So I emailed his boss in Washington, D.C., a woman, and said, hey, look, I think I'm being stonewalled here. I had this communication link opened up here and now it's closed. And she didn't even respond. She sent it back to the FAA hotline. And they came back with, I'll make this brief too. They came back saying, look, we had 2 previous whistleblower reports submitted that have already addressed this issue, and this system is no longer installed in the aircraft. Well, I did a Freedom of Information Act on the 2 whistleblower reports. One didn't exist and the other one was totally irrelevant. So I came back to him and said, look, I want a name, phone number, and email address of a point of contact within the FAA hotline team that I can discuss this with directly, and they wouldn't give it to him. So just yesterday, after having emailed the Federal Aviation Administration administrator, and he didn't respond, I sent a certified letter to him addressing the fact that we're being stonewalled. And so that's where we are with him. So it's kind of a 2-pronged attack, one on the legal side and the other on the administrative side. And I really, in all honesty, don't expect much success with what I'm doing with the FAA, because for them to admit that they agree with this would blow the holy hell out of the whole 9/11 story, that there were Muslim hijackers at the controls. So we're going to run the full gamut with this thing all the way to the top. We'll take it to the Secretary of Transportation, up to the Inspector General for the Transportation Department, and write a letter to the President. Not that I'm expecting a response there either. Just to show people that the system's corrupt and they're not going to address our issues. So
yeah. Now, can I just ask, when uninterruptible autopilot is activated, who has control and who is likely to have had control on that ill-fated day?
Well, that's a $64 million question, Chris. And I know it wasn't Osama bin Laden in a cave 8,000 miles from the scene of the incident. So that I cannot answer directly. All our organization is really, we're not saying what happened on 9/11 or who controlled the airplane or whatever. We're saying what could not have happened, and that is the hijackers could not have flown the airplane. And we allege that the only logical alternative explanation is this system.
Yeah, no, that's it. I mean, I've flown several types of light aircraft and helicopters myself, and I know for a fact if you put me in a cockpit of a modern commercial aircraft, I'd be completely lost. I mean, why do people even believe that these supposed hijackers could even handle this highly complex multi-engine jet?
Well, I believe this, that the bulk of the global population fell for the official story for that exact reason. They're not pilots, and they cannot conceive of the absurdity of this ludicrous notion that these inexperienced pilots flew the aircraft. And that's what the website in part is designed to show, the differences in the airplane and the inexperience of the pilots, and introduce this uninterruptible autopilot, which incidentally, there hasn't been a pilot yet that we've interviewed that was aware that this system even existed until we explained it to them. So very few people are aware of it. And I'll get into it more a little bit later, but there's a reason for that. So
yeah. I'd like to ask you about a gentleman that I came across when I was doing some research, a man named Field McConnell.
a good friend of mine.
Yeah, could we talk about Captain McConnell and how he fits into this story?
Oh, sure. I'm glad you brought him up because we profiled him on the website. One of the pages of the website is devoted to him.
Yeah.
After my illegal termination in 2003, I actually went back to school at Georgia State University for a couple of years with the intent of being a psychologist, but and kind of dropped out of the truth movement. But I had a massive email system. It was before Twitter and Facebook, so I would send out an email and say, please forward to your family, friends, and neighbors, and I would expand out from there. Well, someone caught wind of the fact of what happened to me and contacted me and said, hey, there's a pilot named Field McConnell over Northwest Airlines that would probably like to speak with you. So they gave me his phone number and I called him. And it turned out Field, who was a DC-10 captain at Northwest Airlines, had exposed illegal modifications on Boeing jet aircraft. That's how general it was, okay? And what they did was take him out his schedule, put him on sick list, was going to try to force him to see an FAA quack shrink named Dr. James Elliott in Los Angeles, and they were going to try to ground him just the same way I did. And I said, Field, don't do it. It's a setup. I explained to him what happened to me. And within several days later, he retired 9 years early. He lost about $4 million too doing it, but he retired 9 years early. So he wouldn't get this bogus diagnosis where he could serve as an expert witness in future litigation. So Field and I established this relationship. And I don't know if you know who David Hawkins is, but I introduced David to Field also because David had contacted me and wanted me to work with him. And those two worked for years together. But Field, probably in February of 2007, I mean, Field started talking to me about the uninterruptible autopilot. And that was my aha moment. That was because I knew, besides exposing the holes in the aviation security system when they grounded me, when they came out and stated the resume flight experience of these hijackers, I said, there's no way. They had to have had massive training somewhere, somehow, for them to have been able to do this. And then I even questioned whether they would have been able to do it. So he answered my question with this uninterruptible autopilot. And both he and I, for the past, since 2007, have been trying to expose this. And it's very difficult to do when you don't have the mainstream media listening to you. But that's how I met Field.
Now, could you tell us about the security issues you now face at airports when you travel?
Well, I think the whole system's a farce because there's still a lot of the holes in the system that I saw back in 2002, 2003. As a matter of fact, I've read articles where they run tests on the airport security system, testing TSA, and they fail about 85% of the time. And how many terrorists have they actually caught going through airport security? So I get frustrated standing in the long lines, as I'm sure everyone else does, stripping down almost to your underwear and having to give you X-rayed.
Has there been quite a few three-letter agencies taking interest in yourself personally when you arrive at airports?
Oh, yes. I was very active on Facebook until I got kicked off for security reasons. And the very post that I got kicked off for was exposing the uninterruptible autopilot and tying it not only to the 9/11 aircraft, but to Malaysia Air 370 and Jacob Rothschild. And I had 5 supporting links. And within 5 minutes, they kicked me off for security reasons and wouldn't let me back on. But about a year and a half ago, my wife and I were planning a trip back to the States. Now, we hadn't been back for a few years. And the very day I made my reservations on Qatar Airways through Doha to Atlanta, the FBI calls my ex-wife in DC and wanted to know everything about the trip. My sister calls me and says, hey, they're looking for you. So I called FBI headquarters and said, what gives? Why are you asking about my trip? And they wouldn't tell me anything. So I said to my wife, stand by. When we get to Atlanta, something's going to happen. They're looking for me. So sure enough, we get into the immigration hall, passport control, and she went over to the foreigners line because she's a Pakistani, and I went to the U.S. line. And about 2 minutes later, a man and a woman's escorting her over to my location. They opened the cordon off area, introduced themselves, and one was an FBI agent, the other was a TSA agent. And they said to me, you have time for questions? I go, sure, I was expecting you. So they took us over to a desk that didn't have a line and said stamp their passports. And when the immigration officer got on the computer, he looked up the FBI agent and goes, hey, you know this guy's red, don't you? Well, I didn't ask him what that meant, but I thought, what the heck is red mean? anyhow, we go into a room and they wanted to know everything about my trip, where I was going to be. They wanted phone numbers for each location. And I thought that was the end of it. Well, we were there for a month and we were leaving the Atlanta airport and we just cleared through security coming out into a crowded concourse. Now imagine, they had to have known what flight I was going to be on, that I was coming through security at that time, and what I looked like. And another TSA and FBI agent approached me from behind and said, "You have time for questions?" This time they took me into a room with my wife and closed the door. And the first thing the FBI agent did was show me his badge and say, "Look, we certainly respect your First Amendment freedom of speech rights. And we thank you for your 10 years of service in the U.S. Navy. Have you ever been threatened?" I said, "No, why? Should I feel threatened?" And he goes, "No." And my wife, they start saying, they knew everything about me. They knew about my naval career. They knew about posts that I was very vocal on Facebook. So they knew about all my Facebook posts, in my groups, everything about me. And my wife finally buries her head in her lap, laughing, and said, "He's harmless. He posts on Facebook." And I said, "Well, hon, let them do their job. I've obviously raised some eyebrows, and we'll just answer their questions." So it kept me for about a half hour. And a year later, we went to the States. The same thing happened. So yeah, they have my number. They know what I'm saying and doing. And when I send out emails, I copy every government office I have an email address for. So they're very aware of what I'm saying and doing and what our organization is all about, but I don't care. I'm not doing it.
Maybe we should just say hello to them now while we're on.
Yeah. Hey, fellas.
Hello,
How you
everyone.
How's the family? How's the kids?
Yeah. Now, I just heard you mention you just talk about the Malaysia Flight 370. I'd like to get into that a little bit. So how is Jacob Rothschild tied into all this? What's your take on all this?
Well, I can't get into how I feel about Zionist involvement and Israel's involvement in 9/11, or I'll be labeled an anti-Semite for even bringing up Zionism. But I feel, as do others, that it went much further beyond the Israeli government and the U.S. government, rogue elements there on both counts, to much higher powers in government. And when you talk, in world affairs, Jacob Rothschild, the City of London, Washington, D.C., some people even say the Vatican involvement. But if you look at Malaysia Air 370, and I cannot absolutely confirm this, but there were 20 Malaysian and Chinese scientists on board that aircraft, 4 of which held the patent on this KL-03 microchip that had defense applications, and the 5th patent holder was Jacob Rothschild. Whereas if the 4 died, he would gain sole ownership of this patent for this device. And you got to look at a company called Blackstone that he sits on the board of directors with, and its relationship with the Carlyle Group to tie it all together. And it's too lengthy to get into here.
Maybe another podcast, eh?
Yeah. But I will say this. A gentleman from New Zealand named Declan Curran contacted me. He's an aviation investigator, and he's written a 450-page book called Lies and Deceptions. And it covers not just Malaysia Air 370, but also Malaysia Air 17, which was supposedly shot down over the Ukraine. Okay. And he ties this all together. And he sent me an advance copy of the manuscript that we're helping to get him published here in Pakistan. And I haven't had a chance to read it all, but it's loaded with facts. And hopefully in the future, with Declan's approval, I'll forward this book to the FAA and say, "Here, read this for more details." Because he spent, ever since Malaysia Air 370 went down, he spent all that time researching these accidents, and it's amazing what he's uncovered. But speaking of Malaysia, I got invited on 2 short 3-minute segments on Malaysian TV to discuss the uninterruptible autopilot. And if you go to our website at 911pilots.org, at the About Dan Hanley page. Down at the bottom, there's 2 3-minute videos that I discuss this system. So they know I'm out here discussing it.
No. Now, have you been collaborating your efforts and drive with any other 9/11 groups, such as firefighters, architects and engineers, police, and demolition experts?
Yeah, well, I talked about the Lawyers Committee and those biggest whistleblowers in the world. I know Richard Gage. He's the 20-year San Francisco architect that founded Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. And he's well aware of what I'm doing. He's working with the Lawyers Committee. And for those who don't know anything about that organization, they got a great website also. You can go there.
Yeah.
But basically, he was able to collect over 3,000 architects and engineers worldwide who are demanding an investigation into 9/11 because they allege that based on the structural design of the Twin Towers, they could not possibly have been brought down by aircraft impact or jet fuel fires. So I'm working with him. He knows it. And also Dr. Niels Harrit, I've spoken with a few times in email. He gets my emails. Dr. Niels Harrit was a 42-year retired chemistry professor from the University of Copenhagen. And what he and a group of scientists around the world did, they were able to collect dust samples from the debris field of the three towers that came down that day. And a lot of people aren't aware of Building 7, the third tower that came down. But anyhow, what they discovered was a substance called nanothermite throughout the debris field, okay? And what significance is this? Well, jet fuel burns at a max temperature of 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, and steel melts at 2,750. Well, if you looked at the explosion that occurred immediately after the aircraft impact, most of the jet fuel was consumed within a few minutes. And you saw black smoke emanating from the field, from the buildings, which indicates an office fire, which burns at about 300 or 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, molten iron was seen pouring like lava out of the buildings prior to their collapse. And also in the debris field after their collapse, they said it was like a steel foundry down there. The steel was flowing like lava. Well, it just so happens that nanothermite burns at a temperature of 4,000 degrees or greater. So the indications are that this was in the debris field, that it was in the building, and it was pre-planted explosives, and it was brought down by controlled demolition.
Yeah, and there was also a floor within the World Trade Center, which Israeli art students had access to for quite some time. And if anybody goes and searches Israeli art students 9/11, they're going to see some photograph images and the boxes that were filling these rooms that these art students were using. And they were saying that they were using these boxes for art, which was absolutely ridiculous. But if they actually check the numbers and what's on those boxes, they will actually find that these are detonation triggers, which would be used with such explosives for the demolition of buildings. So, when people do scratch the surface and start questioning some of these things that have gone on, a far clearer picture comes as the gathering of evidence brings everything together.
Right. If you go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, even when you look at video, when you look at the side by side of controlled demolitions, and you see when they come down, it's identical right to the T. It's identical to what you would see in a controlled demolition. So I mean, it's just And
you look at the identical collapse of the Twin Towers, where you've got over 100,000 tons of steel and concrete that was dustified. I mean, you didn't see little big pieces. It was dustified in 11 seconds, almost all the way to the surface, leaving about a story tall debris field. And if you look at World Trade Center Building 7, also known as the Solomon Building, at 5:20 in that afternoon, it came down in its own footprint at the near free fall acceleration due to gravity in less than 7 seconds. Now, I always point out that never in the 100-year history of steel reinforced high-rise concrete building fires has any ever collapsed, and on 9/11, 3 did.
I know.
You explain that.
Yeah, well, even on World Trade Center 7, and again, if any of the viewers want to go online and have a look, and if they put in World Trade Center 7, BBC reported prior to it coming down, the actual BBC News in the UK actually reported that Building 7 had come down, whilst in the background, the reporter is there, and World Trade Center 7 is still standing. You can see the building. But,
Yeah.
there was also calls for that building. I mean, we've seen that the roof dropped in. It was, again, another typical of what you would see with the demolition. But there was reports from police and some of the police who have and firefighters who have come out and spoken about this, where they were told to get back. And on the radios, the people were being asked, are we going to pull it, which is a demolition term? And they said, yeah, we're going to pull the building. And they moved everyone back, ready for that building to come down. So, somebody was in the know and coordinating this at the time for that building alone to come down the way it did.
Well, the University of Alaska Fairbanks conducted a 4-year study on Building 7, and they used computer modeling to simulate the collapse. And they proved conclusively that nearly symmetrically, all 44 support columns for the building collapsed, okay? Initially, the National Institute of Standards and Technology came out and said the building collapse was due to office fires. And when they submitted these evidence packages, the NIST, or National Institute of Standards and Technology, refuted the remarks saying, no, we're sticking with our claim. But when the University of Alaska presented their report, they've altered it a little bit, saying, well, it was due to the structural failure of one beam on one quadrant of the building that brought the whole building down. So the whole story is a joke.
Yes.
The whole story is a joke.
So I'd like to ask you, I know we touched on it a little bit earlier, but could you explain to our audience why you feel that these hijackers could not have flown the profile that we've been told?
Sure. On our website, we have several pages that we walk people through. And the first one is the airplanes themselves. And we show a photo of a Cessna 172, which was the primary training aircraft for the hijackers. And then we show the size of a Boeing 767 aircraft. Now you're looking at a Cessna 172 that weighs less than a ton compared to a 100-ton aircraft. And the handling, because I flew Cessna 172s and know how inexperienced I was over 50 years ago, and also flew the 757 and 767, I know it's impossible for those guys to have been able to manage that airplane just from the handling characteristics of the aircraft alone. So we show those pictures and say, you be the judge. And then we go inside the aircraft and we do a photo comparison of a Cessna 172 cockpit with that of a Boeing 767. And when you look at the instruments on the 172, they're the old round dial instruments. You got a few knobs and switches, one engine indicator, a very simple cockpit with just instruments on one side of it. And then you scroll down and you look at the cockpit of a Boeing 767 and you see a vast array of instruments, CRT displays, switches, knobs, and there's no comparison. And you've got to know that these flight management computers are the primary navigation source for the aircraft, okay? And people don't realize that the advanced navigation system on these modern sophisticated jet aircraft is derived from cruise missile technology and is very accurate, but they wouldn't have a clue how to program the flight management computers. You've got 4 engine instruments for each engine compared to one single instrument, and there's just no comparison. And again, we say, you be the judge, okay? But then we go to the hijackers themselves, and we profile just the 3 hijackers that supposedly hit building, okay? And Hani Muhammad Atta was the supposed hijacker for American 11 that hit the first plane that hit the North Tower, okay? And he had a commercial and multi-engine rating, and people said, well, that's adequate. Well, no, those ratings only require a couple hundred hours to accrue, and they had only been training for a year and a half, 2 years. So, and they did receive training in the United States on aircraft. So we're not denying that fact. But the idea that this guy climbed into a 767 cockpit sight unseen, got it up to over 500 miles per hour, and precisely struck the North Tower almost in the center of the building. We draw the analogy, and it wasn't original. I heard it on another program, but it's accurate. It would be akin to getting in a semi-tractor trailer that you never driven before after having your driver's license for about a year and a half, getting it up to 500 miles per hour and trying to drive it through a Jiffy Lube without scraping the sides of the truck. That's how accurate he would have to been. And you look at the closure rate on the building, and had he been a few degrees off heading, he would have missed the building entirely. We say that it was impossible for him to perform. And then the next hijacker we profile is a guy named Marwan Al-Shahi. He was from the United Arab Emirates, and he had flown about a comparable amount of time and had a commercial rating as Muhammad Atta did. As a matter of fact, they came to the States together and trained together. But if you look at the film footage of United 175, the one that hit the South Tower, he's coming in. He was the fastest airplane. He's doing almost 600 miles an hour. And he's coming in from the south. And just about 12 seconds prior to impact, the aircraft snaps into a 30-degree angle of bank turn. And had he not started that turn at precisely that moment with that correct angle of bank, someone has computed geometrically that he would have missed the building by 800 feet. So we're saying that would be a difficult, if not impossible, maneuver to be performed at that speed and closure rate for a very experienced pilot. But the real smoking gun is Hani Hanjour that I mentioned before with the Pentagon profile.
Yeah.
This guy came to the States in the mid 1990s. He was from Saudi Arabia, and he took some training, and then he went back. And about a year before 9/11, he came back to the States and tried to re-enroll in the school that he had attended before. And he was such a poor student that they wouldn't even take him back. We've got, when you go to the hijackers page on our website, and if you scroll to the bottom, we've got real extensive notes on Hani Hanjour, because he's a smoking gun. He's the one we're saying there's no way this guy could have performed that maneuver and hit the building on his first attempt at ground level. So 1 month prior to 9/11, he goes to the Freeway Airport in Maryland and tries to rent a 172, and they wouldn't even rent it to him because he couldn't handle the airplane. He couldn't take off or fly the airplane, so they wouldn't rent it to him. And yet we're given this incredible story that he managed to do that. I know.
Didn't he? It was a Boeing 757, wasn't it? And he flew it in a perfect 330-degree corkscrew spiral down to a perfect ground level entry into that said office in the Pentagon that we were talking about before. Now, I saw the hole left in the building, and even, when you look at, like, in the 9/11 Commission report itself, and you start looking at the hole in that building there. Now, doesn't an aircraft have rather large wings either side of it for a start?
Yes. Yes.
There's no sign of impact from wings from the aircraft, and not even any marks. Even if it had hit it and the wings had folded, I could say, okay, well, where's the impact marks of those wings? Now, I've also seen footage which shows, whether it's genuine footage, but it shows what appears to be a large high-speed projectile hitting the building. Now, some people have said it looks like a cruise missile. I'm no expert in that field, but what I can say, it doesn't show a plane. Have you seen that footage yourself?
And I'll add one more thing. Sorry, before you answer that. And I saw this tonight, and there was a helicopter that was seen in the area at that time.
Yeah.
Supposedly.
Yeah.
By eyewitnesses. So yeah, go ahead then.
Well, I've heard all the theories. I won't even call them theories because they're backed by some pretty sound facts. But regarding the Pentagon, some say it was a missile. Some say there's a group out there called Scientists for 9/11 Truth. I mean, I'm sorry. Yeah, Scientists for 9/11 Truth, who claim that American 77 actually hit the building, and they had me on Skype screen share for about 2 hours one night, giving me some pretty overwhelming proof. I mean, if you believe that the damaged flight recorder that they got was accurate and what was from the airplane and did contain that information, that was pretty convincing that it was American 77. But I agree with you, Chris, about the size of the hole, no wing marks on the building, no skid marks, very few airplane parts, etc. So, but I want to emphasize that we don't. I just had a guy last night, a lawyer from New Jersey, contact me and said, Dan, you've got to get into no planes. You got to get a hold of Dr. James Fetzer. He's written a book on this stuff. I've been on 2 programs with Jim Fetzer, and I know where he's coming from. But we don't go there with our organization.
Yeah.
No, we don't go to the collapse of the building. We're just strictly targeting the hijackers and bringing up the remote control system.
Yeah, and while we're still talking about Flight 77, there's a pilot. His name is Russ Wittenberg. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
Yes, I am.
Yeah. So he says he was a commercial pilot that flew 2 of the planes that used in the 9/11. He said it could not have flown at these speeds without going into a high-speed stall. Could you maybe comment on that?
Yeah, the speed these aircraft were clocked on radar, if we're to believe the government here, exceeded the maximum operating speed of a Boeing 757 and 767 at sea level by 120 to 140 knots. And there's, besides a high-speed stall, there's some aircraft structural engineers who claim the aircraft should have come apart in flight at that speed. So the government's got a lot of explaining to do in that regard also.
Is that just down to the air density being completely different at the altitude that planes fly compared to the air density at lower levels when they were still flying at that supposed speed?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Now, I'd like to ask you about an operation called, basically it's called Operation Aphrodite, and it was from 1944. And I know you know a little bit about this.
Yes. Well, that's on our remote control page, and I'd like to cover it extensively because I believe a lot of people are saying this guy's crazy, saying they're remotely controlled. But we give a history, and we only touch on a few examples of remote controlled aircraft. But if you go back as far as 1944, over 75 years ago, in World War II, the U.S. military launched Operation Aphrodite in Europe. And what they did was take old Boeing, old B-124s, gutted them out to reduce the weight of the aircraft so they could load it with 30,000 pounds of a highly incendiary compound called Torpex. And now the pilots were required to make the takeoff, but once they got airborne, they bailed out of the airplane, and these aircraft were remotely controlled to targets in Europe. And it's like the first example of a U.S. military drone aircraft, but they were remotely controlled, and that was over 75 years ago. Now we jump ahead 40 years to 1984. NASA, the National Aeronautic and Space Administration, and the FAA conducted a joint crash test experiment in a remote location where they took a Boeing 720 aircraft, which is a large 4-engine passenger jet aircraft, loaded it with crash dummies and cameras because they wanted to test crew and passenger survivability in the event of a crash landing. And they took the airplane off by remote control, flew it around the pattern several times, auto-landing it before intentionally crash landing the airplane. And we got a short film on there that shows it on its final approach where they crashed the airplane. But that was in 1984. And you jump ahead to the mid-1990s. This is when this system called the uninterruptible autopilot was developed. Now it's misleading though. You can go on the internet and Google uninterruptible autopilot or Boeing Honeywell uninterruptible autopilot,
Yeah.
and you'll get a Wikipedia article, and it's misleading.
I got it right here.
Okay.
You want me to read it?
Oh, sure, if you
Yeah.
want.
Okay, it says right here, it says this is straight from the Wikipedia page. It says conspiracy theorists have claimed that the technology has been secretly fitted to some commercial airliners. Some, including historian Norman Davies, have blamed it for the disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, whose cause is unknown as of 2020. According to Bob Mann, an airline industry consultant, evidence of the Boeing uninterruptible autopilot system being installed in a commercial airline has not been published and is not proven to exist. Safety concerns, including the possibility that such a system could be hacked, have prevented its rollout. And that's what it says on the page.
Well, let me just point out something Phil McConnell told me several years ago. Lufthansa was taking delivery on new jets, and they were doing a parts inventory to make sure they got everything that they paid for. And they came across the Boeing uninterruptible autopilot, and they called Boeing and said, "What's this piece of equipment about?" And when they were told, they said, "Take it out of the airplane." So don't tell me that the aircraft manufacturers know that the system even exists.
We know all about how reliable Wikipedia has been, don't we, Chris?
Right.
Yeah.
And who's Bob Mann? But they claim Boeing patented this thing in 2006. But if you scroll down towards the bottom of a remote control page, the late Rob Balsamo, who was a co-founder of Pilots for 9/11 Truth, interviews. It's an audio recording, but he interviews a seasoned avionics technician named Wayne Anderson. It's a 45-minute audio, and it's worth listening to. Yeah. But he goes into detail about how this system worked. They brought a Boeing 757. Now, this is the mid-'90s. They brought it into a hangar, and they were going to bench test the autopilot. And there were mechanics up in the cockpit, and a guy on a laptop computer in maintenance control told him to engage the autopilot. And when he did, he took total control of the aircraft autopilot and flight management computers. And there's nothing they could do to disconnect it. There's 4 ways of disconnecting an autopilot. Turning off the switch you turned it on with, there's a small red button on the yoke or the steering wheel that you can push, and that'll disengage it. Apply a 70-pound force or greater on the yoke, that'll disengage it, or pull a circuit breaker for the autopilot, and that should do it also. Well, they tried pulling every circuit breaker on the airplane, and they couldn't disengage the system. It's backdoored. It's got its own power supply. It exists, and we know it existed prior to 9/11, and that's our contention.
No, I'm surprised that there's not been any more guys who work on the electronics and stuff on some of these jets that haven't come forward either and said, "No, I've seen these as well." Do you have anybody on the site who comes from the engineering background within the aircraft who have been able to supply any photographs or anything to show what these things look like?
No photographs. I've talked to a few guys who want to remain anonymous because they're still employed and they don't want to, but there are people out there that are knowledgeable. I'm real active because I got kicked off Facebook. I'm on Twitter. And a few months ago, a person, I thought it was a man, it turned out to be a woman, came to me because I was posting about the uninterruptible autopilot. I was tweeting it. And he came back with some retweets to me that I thought he was his first name was Captain. I won't say his last name, but I thought it was a pilot. So I messaged him on Twitter and says, "Are you a captain?" And he goes, "No, I was in the police force." But it turns out when he left the police force, he went to work for Raytheon. And and he worked in the very department that produced the system, and told me he had an old email account that he might be able to, he saved all of his emails related to the system. He might be able to provide me with that information. Well, we exchanged a few emails, and then he went silent on me because he was supposed to be in the World Trade Center at a meeting with Raytheon, with the president and vice president of the division that produced the uninterruptible autopilot, and he missed his flight, and they were all killed. And he said for 2 years, well, I believe it was a woman, but they never fully disclosed that to me. He said for 2 years, he moved away from his family because he was being threatened. And I believe that's the reason he didn't want to come forward now with information, because he didn't want to get involved because he knew how visible I was. I guess he was afraid I would expose him. But there have been other people at Boeing that have come forward with information as well. Like the 62-page document I was talking about that I submitted to the FAA. It's actually related to Malaysia Air 370, but it goes into great depth explaining the system, how it works, and what components actually operate the system. So
yeah,
people are afraid.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Now I can understand that people are afraid because obviously the power that's wielded, and I imagine that there's a lot of military intervention in some of these aircraft companies at high levels for people that are controlling this kind of stuff. So yeah, I can understand that for people. Now the Shanksville site looked like an explosive impact, but based on what you've seen in regards to aircraft crash sites over the years, would it be a fair assumption that there should have been far more wreckage here strewn across a greater area?
Yeah, of course. I believe the wreckage or plane parts were found over like an 8-mile area. Is that correct? I don't remember exactly, but
yeah. But the actual
there are people that say there was. Yeah. Oh, there's nothing. There's hardly anything there. There's hardly anything there. I mean, whether there was even an airplane or whether if it was shot down by our own guys. But I really don't get into that much because, like I say, our focus is on the hijackers.
Yeah.
So I'd like to ask,
talking about people not wanting to come. Okay.
No, go ahead, Dan. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to get into these pilot interviews because that's a page, and we've only got 6 of them listed there. We've got other guys in line to be interviewed, but we basically ask there's 6 YouTube videos there, and we ask them to give their flight credentials, and then we describe the Pentagon profile, and they, all, without exception, they all come back and say he couldn't have flown it and I couldn't have flown it either. But those are only 10 to 15 minute videos, but we went out to several hundred pilots. It's very difficult to contact pilots because you got to find an email address or some contact information on them. But we went out to several hundred pilots that we were able to find email addresses on LinkedIn and other places, asking them if they would join us for just a 10-minute interview. And we even sent them the bullet points of the questions we'd be asking and connected with them on Skype. And they fall into 3 categories. One, the pilots are active pilots and they're too afraid to speak out.
Yeah.
2, a lot of pilots say, nah, it happened 20 years ago. It's not relevant, which I think is absurd. It couldn't be more relevant. It's more relevant. 9/11 more relevant than ever.
Yeah.
And the third one, you've got 70% of your pilot workforce presently unemployed, scrambling to just for survival to find another job out there. And the last thing they're interested in is doing a 10-minute interview on 9/11, an event that occurred 20 years ago. But those are some pretty good interviews that should drive home the point that I'm just not the only one out here saying they couldn't have flown it. There are other highly experienced pilots saying the same thing.
Yeah. Now, it looks like the aviation authorities also deliberately tricked you into becoming committed into a mental institution. Can you tell the story about how they managed to get that happen?
Okay.
Yeah.
Again, I'm mentally stable, folks.
We know.
Okay. Because I've got myself in trouble talking about this. I said the doctor at United asked me if I'd be willing to see a company-appointed psychiatrist, and I said yes. So there were 2 pilots in the room with me, one the chief pilot from Chicago and the other the employee assistance program union rep. And they said they'd drive me over there. And on the way over there, I said, you know what this is really all about? And I told them what I was saying. I showed them the FAA whistleblower report I was going to file, everything else. And one of them said, you make me proud to be an Alpha pilot, all this stuff. Well, we get over there. I thought I was going to an office, and we get over there, and it's the Alexian Brothers Behavioral Health Hospital. So I still thought, well, maybe the doctor's got an office in this facility. So we go and check into the front desk, and a Catholic nun meets us. She was a psychologist and escorts us to a room. Well, I'd gotten up at 4 in the morning and it's late in the afternoon, and we go in there and sit down. And here I am trying to explain in simple terms the complexity of aviation safety reporting systems and how I wound up in her office. And I could just tell by the look on her face she wasn't getting it. So we talked for probably about an hour. And then finally she said to me, well, I'm just a psychologist, and United wants you to see a psychiatrist. And we can arrange for you to have a room tonight and get you out first thing in the morning after you see a psychiatrist. Big mistake. I was tired and I was thinking, well, I'm going to have to catch a cab to a hotel, come back in the morning. So I thought this will be the quickest way out of town and get me doing what I was going to do. So I agreed. So they escorted me upstairs. And the first clue I had I might be in trouble is they locked the door behind me at the check-in desk. And then they took my belt and shoes and all my personal belongings. And where I thought I was going to get a private room, they escorted me down the hall to a co-ed wing of this mental institution and told me, look, you got to check under your bed and your bathroom before you go to bed because it's a co-ed wing and females try to get in and molest male patients. And I said to them, no, I'll just lock the door. And they said, you can't, we got to come in and check on you in the evening. So they take me in this room I was sharing with this very sick, mentally ill man. He was, I found out later, paranoid schizophrenic. Put rock hard beds in this facility. And then they came back in the room after I got settled in and said, we want you to take medication to help you sleep. And I said, well, no, I don't need it. I'm very tired anyhow. And they go, well, we insist. Now, let me point out, I didn't mention this before. Once you submit to this employee assistance program, you have to agree whatever the company or the FAA wants you to do. Otherwise, you're out of this program. So I was trying to protect my pay, which was pretty good at the time because I had overhead expenses and they were going to cut me off my pay. So I thought, okay, go along with the program here. I said, sure, I'll take your medicine. So they take me down and it was sort of like one flew over the cuckoo's nest. I'm standing in a long line at the medicine dispense window. And I finally get up there. They make me take 2 pills, open my mouth to make sure I swallowed them, all this stuff. And I go back to the room and fell asleep. And about 4 o'clock in the morning, they found me unconscious with a huge welt on the side of my face. The only light in the room was coming in from the hallway. And as I regained consciousness, I was surrounded by a doctor and nurses. And they were taking my blood pressure and they go, it's 60/40. And I thought I was dying. I didn't know, I had no idea what was happening. They got me back in bed, and it appears that whatever medicine they gave me caused this. I guess I got up to use the bathroom or something, and they got me back in bed. And then to cover their butts the next morning, they ran me for a physical. And I tried to explain to this doctor what had happened and why I was there, and he didn't want to hear any of it. So I thought I was going to see the psychiatrist this next day. And instead, they said I had to go to group therapy sessions. And I told them I don't need this. And they said, no, all patients are required to attend. So I thought, okay, I'll go along with their program. So here I sat in a room with about 20 people talking about their problems, and I had nothing to offer there. And then they came in and wanted to run some tests on me. Well, they were the identical tests. I can't think of the name of the test now. Anyhow, it's not important. They were the same tests my shrinks in Atlanta had run on me. So, and I passed with flying colors. So I took those tests for them. And again, a psychologist came in and talked briefly with me. Nothing big, but the second night there, because I didn't get to see a psychiatrist, I couldn't sleep because the guy in the room was snoring real loud. So I went out. Went up to the desk and said, "Can you give me a book out of my belongings?" Which he did. And I went down to the end of the hall where there was a light. It was dark otherwise, and I'm sitting there reading a book, and this big African American gentleman comes up with a real nice suit on. I see him coming down the end of the hall. I thought, "Who's this?" And he walked up and he goes, "Hi, Dan. I know why you're here." And I didn't say, "Well, who are you?" or anything. He said, "What are you reading?" I said, "That book, a spiritual book, actually it was." And he said, "Look, why don't you just drop what you're doing and come on back to work? And I said to him, because I believe what I'm doing is the correct behavior for a captain at an airline. I haven't done anything wrong. And we had a few more comments, and he goes, okay, your choice, and walked back down the hall. And I said, who is that guy, right? So finally, the third day, the psychiatrist comes in and sits down and talks to me, and we're having a congenial conversation. And I finally said to her, well, Doc, you run these few tests on me. You're the first psychiatrist I'm seeing here. What is your diagnosis going to be? And she goes, I'm going to say you're bipolar. And I did that, and I chuckled a little bit and said, I know exactly what that is, and I haven't exhibited any of the symptoms of that disorder, and have two mental health professionals in Atlanta that will beg to differ with you on the diagnosis. I said, look, she was an Indian from India, right? And I said to her, look, you're an Indian? You're from India? She goes, yes. I said, I see you have a crucifix. You're a Christian woman, right? She goes, yes. And I said, have you ever read Gandhi's autobiography? She goes, of course. And I said, well, I'm going to pull a Gandhi on you and passively resist the rest of this process. I'm not going to participate anymore with what you're doing here. I'm going to be released. And she goes, okay, I agree to do it. So that's when I finally got out. Well, I got to back up. The day that I agreed to submit to being admitted to this institution, right? United Airlines, my wife at the time was a flight attendant, had just landed in London, and they contacted her and said, something's happened to your husband. He's in a mental institution. We got to get you back to Chicago. And they flew her through New York to Chicago. So she shows up hysterical, thinking that I've had some kind of a breakdown or something. And then they were kind enough to call my kids, who were young at the time, and said, your dad's in a mental institution in Chicago. My kids never looked at me the same since they said that to me.
Yeah,
okay.
That's terrible.
The stigma was attached, and I couldn't convince them otherwise. So it was a horrific experience, and I paid a heavy price. But that really isn't my impetus or the people I'm working with for moving forward with this. There's been 2,977 people died in the United States, a terrible death on 9/11. And our hearts and prayers go out to the next of kin there. But that number pales in comparison to the millions of Muslims and others who have been murdered, maimed, or displaced due to the illegal and unwarranted invasions in the Middle East and South Asia due to the lies of 9/11. So that's really why we're pushing forward. There's never been a criminal investigation into 9/11. People say, well, there was a 9/11 commission. That was not a criminal investigation.
Yeah.
And that's really what we're demanding here. The lawyers committee, architects, and all the others are demanding that we have a complete independent criminal investigation on 9/11.
Yeah. So when you think about what these guys have done to you, and the magnitude of the deception that has occurred in this 9/11 narrative, what other lies and falsehoods could the U.S. and other governments around the world be pulling off? And is there any limit to the deceptions? If they could do this, what couldn't they do? You know what I mean? Like, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I talked about media complicity in covering up this story for 20 years, right?
Yeah.
And we could jump ahead to a separate topic, and that's this COVID scamdemic and what's going on. And look, I'm not foolish enough to say that there's no COVID virus out there, because something's killed an awful lot of people. But the same people that have perpetuated the lies of 9/11 for 20 years in the mainstream media are the very same people that are spewing out these hourly statistics on the news, scaring the hell out of people about the deaths and the number of cases, and I refuse to believe it. Yeah. So again, you can go back to 1983. In 1983, there were over 50 independent news media outlets in the United States. Today, there's only 6 major media conglomerates that control 96% of the news we read or see. Okay. The same year in 1983, Israel launched the Hezbollah project. Okay. And the Hezbollah project was designed to infiltrate the U.S. media to force to cast a favorable light on Israel. Okay. If you go to there's several memes out there, but you can go and look at these 6 media conglomerates and who occupies the positions of power in each one of them. You see this tremendous support for Israel. No one criticizes Israel, okay? And there are those who believe, myself included, that Israel was complicit in the crimes of 9/11, and that will never be reported in the mainstream media, which is why they would never interview me or Richard Gage or Dave Meiswinkle. They don't want the story out there. They don't want the story told.
Yeah.
So.
No, it's right, and you know, you look at the likes of the explosion over at the Japanese Fukushima site, and
Right.
the security again for that building, and again, it was said about that people had seen, you know, they said it's suitcase-sized nukes, but again, it was an Israeli security company that had taken over the security of that Japanese power station at that time. And you know, you start looking at the likelihood of a lot of these events where there seems to be some kind of intelligence operatives behind them, and all the trails always seem to lead back to the same country for the sophistication of security that they're doing. And you know, again, you know, this may just be a coincidence, but I think that when there's too many coincidences going on, that it can no longer be a coincidence.
Right, I agree. And
Yeah.
you got to look at most crimes, or if not all of them, have a means and a motive. Okay, and you got to look at 9/11 in that regard. Okay, they claim that the motive behind the attacks with Bin Laden and his 19 hijackers was they hated the American way of life, and they wanted to attack the United States. Okay, well, they certainly did not have the means to employ the uninterruptible autopilot system. But if you look at the United States and Israel, the United States alone has spent $6.2 trillion on wars since 9/11. Someone reaped tremendous profits from that, and we can suspect that it was the military industrial complex. So they certainly had the motive, the financial motive, to want to accommodate the crime of 9/11, but they certainly had the means with the drone technology that they have to employ the uninterruptible autopilot. And if you go to Israel, most people aren't familiar with the Greater Israel Project, also known as the Oded Yinon Plan. Okay, if you Google Greater Israel Project, a global research article pops up that's excellent, and it describes how Zionism is a political ideology that claims ownership of all lands from the Euphrates to the Nile River as their biblical prophesied promised land. Okay. So in essence, I'm not anti-Zionist, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm not against Jews or Judaism or anything like that, but I am opposed to Zionism because I don't agree with his idea. But if you look at Greater Israel, what the countries that's comprised of, and overlay it on a map of the Middle East, you'll see exactly what the intent of Israel and the United States was, and that was to totally destabilize or overthrow governments in the Middle East to bring forward this Greater Israel Project. So they had the means, they had the motive for doing it. And as far as drone technology and the means, Israel was probably the first country to ever come out with drone technology after the 6-Day War because they lost so many jets. Yeah. And they've been producing drone type aircraft since 1973. So they certainly had the means, the technology to have accomplished what happened on 9/11.
Yeah, and those countries that you were mentioning there, where you say there's an overlay, and if people want to check this out again on YouTube, there is a general called General Wesley Clark, and General Wesley Clark is quite open about the conversations he had with some of the higher level generals and staff within the government who had said, literally after 9/11, that these memos were coming down and literally listed the countries that they were going to invade over the next 8 years. And these are the countries which, as to plan, they have followed through suit and literally gone in and overthrown these countries either through war or civil uprising and unrest within those countries to destabilize the governments, only to put their own people in and take gain and control over those.
Exactly. I didn't mention, we got together with a documentary film producer in Lahore. I'll just mention, I live in Islamabad, Pakistan. I've lived here for 11 years, and no, I'm not hiding out. Fell in love with and married a Pakistani in 2010, and I've lived here ever since. But anyhow, we got together with a documentary film producer and another gentleman who's an actor and a film narrator in Texas. This guy is in Lahore, the producer, and we're creating a documentary called 9/11, the advent of the Ninth Crusade, or eight major crusades. We're claiming 9/11 was the ninth because it was obviously an attack on Islam and the Muslim world. But we're still in the production stage of this thing. But I just want to say thanks to Amanda Whittle in London and to Anders Ahlstrom in Sweden and Richard Dillman in all places, Siberia, for all the support they gave us on producing this documentary film. But we're looking forward to that. And we're trying to find a way of distributing the film from Casablanca to Jakarta and all Muslim countries in between, because it's going to mainly cover the uninterruptible autopilot. Yeah. It's going to be mainly the material on our website because people aren't aware. And when they hear there were no Muslim hijackers at the controls of the 9/11 aircraft, that will resonate well with the 1.8 billion Muslims in the world.
Yeah. No, you took the words right out of my mouth. I was just gonna ask you what I knew you had something on the go coming up, so that's great. Promoting that documentary. I think, Dan, that we're gonna start to wind things down and wrap it up. But before we do, I'd like to ask you about your experience in Islamabad and with the Muslim people. I know you spoke of this before. Could you tell us, what kind of experience you've had since you've moved there and lived there?
Well, the first time I came over was 2009, and the war and terror was still going full blast over here, and I was actually experiencing fear about coming over here, thinking that they hated Americans because of the illegal drone strikes that killed over 600 civilians, and nothing could be further from the truth. From day one, I've been welcomed with open arms. They love Americans. A lot of them will ask me, how can you help me get to the United States? I want to live there. They just do not like the U.S. government and U.S. foreign policy. But a lot of people don't realize that more than any country in the world, Pakistan has had the greatest loss of life due to terrorism, which is 70,000 people. And it's a poor country that they've spent over $120 billion fighting the war on terror that they didn't want to participate in to begin with. But then under Secretary of State Richard Armitage, right after 9/11, came over here and told the ISI, their version of the CIA, that if you don't participate in the war on terror, we will, quote, bomb you back into the Stone Age. And here 20 years later, I mean, the current Prime Minister Imran Khan, who I have great admiration for, says we'll never fight another country's war again. Because as you know, Pakistan supported the United States in the Afghan-Russian war in the 80s and early 90s. So they paid a great price for their participation in there. But I tell people, I'm not going to get kickbacks from the travel industry, but come to Pakistan. It's got a great cultural and historic heritage, and it's worth coming over to visit. It's a very colorful country. One more thing, if I could plug, is I'm also writing a book. I've written it. I've co-authored it with a gentleman in Knoxville, Tennessee, and a publisher in Lahore has promised me to publish it. And it's called Grounded, A True Story of a 9/11 Pilot Whistleblower. And it tells the whole story of my career. And that part's maybe a little boring for people to read, but it leads up to my termination And then the last half of the book really gets into details about a lot of the topics we discuss here today.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that's awesome. I just want to thank you so much, Dan. I know it's really, really courageous and I have a lot of admiration for you to do this and to really to speak out and to speak your truth. And I just want to say it's very commendable for you to do this and speak with us tonight. I really appreciate it. Chris, do you have anything further for Captain Dan before we sign off?
Yeah, just one more thing, Dan. If you were to achieve anything in your lifetime to feel that all that you've done was not in vain, what would that be?
well, to expose the lies of 9/11, but if I could just get out the word, or we, I should say, because there's a lot of people that have joined us from around the world on the website. If we could just get out the word that this uninterruptible autopilot exists and that these hijackers weren't qualified, that is my goal in life, and that's what I'm 72 now, and I'm going to continue with this work until they either blow my head off or I'm successful, or I die. That's my life mission right now, and I feel like it's important, so I'm going to continue on.
And what message do you have for other pilots out there that you know what you're saying to be true, and what can be done to encourage them to speak out?
Well, first thing they could do is go to our website at 911pilots.org and join us. And it's real simple. All we need is your first name, last name, and email address. And there's a comments box down there they can put in their flight credentials. We say for pilots indicate what type aircraft you've flown. And then we get in contact with them, connect with them on Skype and interview them. So the more the merrier, the more people we have coming out and saying that it was impossible for these pilots that have flown the airplane, the better off we'll be.
Yeah.
Well, Dan, I just want to thank you again so much for sharing your story and touching on this topic that we think is very important as well. And so we're going to sign off for tonight. And like we say here, love one another, believe nothing, and question everything.
Thank you both for having me on. It was enjoyable.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Okay. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.